Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the interactive session on the theme, A Dialogue for Gender-Sensitive Community. And our today's session will be delivered by our guest speaker, Dr. Sucharita Sengupta ma'am. Dr. Sucharita is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. She has completed her graduation from Lady Shri Ram College, University of Delhi, and went on to pursue a master's, M.Phil and PhD at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has previously worked with the Indian Express Chandigarh, the Energy and Resources Institute, University of Pennsylvania Institute for the Advanced Study of India, and Indraprastha College for Women, University of Delhi. Her areas of interest include climate politics, urban studies, and gender. Now, I would like to invite our guest speaker to deliver today's session. Ma'am, we have about 2 hours for the session, and in the first half, we can have a talk by you, and in the second half, we can try to make the session more interactive. So I request all our participants to engage directly with our speaker. And I also request all our participants to keep their camera switched on throughout the session. Thank you so much, ma'am. We can start.
So very good afternoon, everyone. Bezat, Pragya, Zoya, all three of you, thank you so much for having me over. So this is the second time I've been invited for your program. Earlier, I had spoken on climate politics, but this time I thought, since we've already gone over that and it's recorded, we'll go over a different topic, and that's why I chose to speak on the question of gender and dialogue, and just to see, a few ways in which we can include gender sensitivity in the way in which we talk about other issues as well. So that's what I would like to talk to you about. Yesterday I attended an event in the evening where some of you may be familiar with her, the political scientist, Professor Neera Chandok. She was speaking, and the context of this discussion, it was the history and the functioning of the Indian Parliament. So the book was written by someone else, the whole functioning of the Indian Parliament. But while many issues were coming in, while the speakers were talking about what was in the book itself, she made one particular reference which I thought might be pertinent to start my lecture with today. She was listening into these televised debates that happened. They used to be, at least earlier, the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha channels, so you could tune into that and listen to what our parliamentarians are discussing, how they're discussing, and even now you can find these clips on YouTube. So she was listening into these debates, and she was particularly listening to the debate on the women's reservation bill in the well of the House. And, she said that as I heard, I was recoiling with disgust and horror. And what was that? It was about the sort of references that were being made about women. So as politicians were, giving their speech, and as you know, this bill has been tabled for a very long time, but it has not been passed because there are all kinds of oppositions. But the primary, which I see as the biggest roadblock, is the fact that political parties who are on even rival ends of the spectrum sort of get together and have decided that they will not let this bill pass. So that's the biggest problem. And that's what we hear, but she actually heard what was being said, and the sort of things that were being said about women were terrible, right? And when she was narrating this incident, she had this very, very disturbed and very upset look on her face. And when I was listening to her say that in that particular way, someone who's worked all her life on these issues, I also felt extremely disturbed. And I thought it's probably a good way to draw attention to how pervasive the problem of misogyny is in our society. And although I am making a reference to, what we saw in India, what we saw in the highest seat of our democracy, I must emphasize that patriarchy is not a place-specific problem at all. It is a very, very pervasive problem. You could go to any country, any society, even the ones that mark themselves out as very advanced countries, you will find patriarchy operating in some format or the other. So the format may be a little different from what we have in the global south or in South Asia, but nevertheless, you are going to find it. So this is not necessarily, about cherry picking on our own country. This is more to indicate that this is what, is available for us to see immediately in our own surroundings. Now, I do feel that as a woman, we are subject to misogyny our entire life, and that a narration of this type at a public event will not disturb me. But actually, that's not what happened. You never, despite all the misogyny that is thrown at you, all the patriarchy that is thrown at you, you never quite get used to something like this. And the question then that arose, that struck me, is that if in the highest seat of our democracy, this is the sort of attitudes that you have towards women, and there's an undisguised, right? There's not even a veneer that we are going to disguise it. What are the expectations that we can have from wider society and polity? And the fact is that whatever is happening in the well of the house is ultimately a reflection of what is going on in our society. So the first thing to flag is that much as we've advanced so much in so many different ways, patriarchy has not gone anywhere. And since patriarchy has not gone anywhere, that's why continuing to have this kind of a discussion is very, very relevant and very, very pertinent. It's not a thing of the past. Those of us who are present here today, irrespective of our gender, would whatever I've said so far will probably find it, a very, very familiar sort of a story. Many of us have faced this kind of a situation, and others, those who have by dint of their gender not faced it, but have probably observed it happening to someone they know. So either way, it's not an unfamiliar or a new thing that I'm talking about. So we are part of this program on how to have a better dialogue within communities. And I think the idea is to move towards betterment or towards resolution of thorny issues. I choose to speak on this gender because I feel that this fault line is hardly showing any signs of disappearing, despite quite a few centuries of awareness raising and activism. Despite all the advances that have been made from the time when women were treated as property. In fact, women were treated as subhuman. They're not even treated as human. The very fact that you can treat them as property means that you do not even really count them as human. To now, at this point, when women are the bearers of rights, parity between genders is still quite a distant dream. Now, I was going through, the previous lectures that you've had, and I noticed that Professor Savisachi and Dr. Krishnaswamy Dara has discussed two pertinent issues with you related to dialogue. One is the social context of dialogue, and the other were the conditions that are probably make dialogue happen, right? That are necessary for dialogue to happen. I'm sure that they have dwelled at very great length and with great expertise on both of these issues. So that's not what I will go into, and I will keep the focus on gender. So the question on my mind is that, is a dialogue of any type at all possible if women and other genders are excluded and invisibilized, right? So is that even a good way to have any sort of dialogue, no matter how important the issue is? If you're excluding a large chunk of the population and their perspectives, then what are the outcomes? What are you going to get? Are you reproducing patriarchy? Are you reproducing the same systems over and over? Following from this, some other questions. For example, if we do embark to address this issue central to the human community, what can a dialogue look like? Because it doesn't end at, just including people. Then you have to wonder, are we in formal dialogue settings? Are we in informal dialogue settings, right? I mean, as such, if you were to ask me, I think dialogue is a continuous process when you have more formal settings, which are more controlled, where participation is somewhat limited. There you can still structure how the dialogue goes somewhat, right? Of course, the idea is to not control everything and to let have some free flow. But outside of that, when we are having informal conversations, that also I see as a kind of a dialogue. You could be in the space of the college, you could be in the space of the university, you could be sitting in the canteen and having tea and chatting with your friends, you could be having a conversation with your teachers, you could be at a party and having conversations with your friends. Absolutely everything that forms part of what Habermas calls the public sphere, right? That's where this informal dialogue is going on pretty much continuously, right? So the question is that when we have this dialogue, what does it look like? What should it look like? What can it look like? This was a second thing that occurred to me that I'll probably speak about this. And a third question then, are there going to be challenges? Which is very obvious. It doesn't matter what issue you pick up. The reason we pick up issues is that there are already challenges over there. And with what mindset and with what methods do we go about addressing these challenges? So there are two things here. One is the attitudes that we bring into any form of a dialogue, and the other is the methods. The attitude, according to me, becomes important in terms of whether you are coming with a closed mindset or an open mindset, and B, there's a variety of prejudices that all of us bring. No matter how enlightened we are, no matter how progressive we believe we are, no matter what our politics, we all bring a set of biases with us. And so, is that going to enable the dialogue, or is that going to inhibit the dialogue in any way? Particularly, with gender, which I'll later speak about at greater length, there's a question of power, right? So what kind of attitude do we bring? Do we want to give up our power? Do we want to share power, right? And also the methods. I'm sure every method will not work. These are difficult issues to work through. Sometimes, very direct ways will not work. Sometimes, wanting to have a perfectly general neutral atmosphere is what will work. But at other times, we have to learn how to deal with what we have. Just to give you again an example, I'm a teacher. I teach a paper on gender. I've been teaching it for nearly 8 to 10 years now. And the classroom, for example, becomes for me a very interesting setting. It shows traits of both a controlled setting as well as a less formal setting. It's controlled to the extent that there's a limited number of participants who are coming in. There's a very clear room. There's a very clear. We all know who's speaking and therefore which side the authority power is on and who's listening. But at the same time, it is probably not as formal as, let's say, a United Nations, conference on women, or a larger setting, a more structured setting like that. Students still have a great deal of freedom to air their views. There is sufficient disagreement. So I would say that it is a kind of a semi-formal setting. And this, for me, has always been a very, very interesting place because the composition of the participants that influences the kind of dialogue that's happening. The personal experiences of the students sitting there is a huge contributor to the sort of conversations that we have in the classroom. Does the gender of the students themselves matter? I would say yes and no. I say yes because, I have to put it out there as bluntly as possible, even though this may not go down well with some of you. But a lot of young men who sit in my class not only come with biases, but even by the end of the semester, I do not even see any softening. If anything, having to sit in a class and listening to a teacher who's talking about gender and going on and on saying, how the patriarchal structure is terrible, gets their backs up. They become even more defensive. Sometimes that happens. But also, that's not like 100% sort of a situation. There are many young men who are extremely sensitive, who are extremely open-minded, who do not come in with these attitudes, and who are willing to learn, and who are willing to engage, and who are willing to listen. With the female students, I find two things happening with the dialogue. One is that they are quiet. They're probably not very free to talk about some of the really terrible personal experiences that they might have had. But at the same time, they feel a quiet sense of confidence in the sense that, listening to someone talk in a structured manner about what you have faced makes you believe that what you are facing is not, it's not a figment of your imagination, right? There's a term called gaslighting. Again, some of you might be familiar with that term. That happens a lot at the societal level, especially when women are airing their grievances. So one is that. The second is, women who do choose to speak up, also men who do choose to speak up either about their own experiences, which are very gendered, or about experiences of, let's say, women or LGBTQIA persons who are part of their lives, right? They choose to speak up. So these are the kind of, trends that I often see in the classroom. And for me, a classroom is absolutely a great place to, not just for my students to learn what I'm saying, but for me to observe my students and see what they're learning, what they're not learning, where they're having difficulty, where there's discomfort, so on and so forth. Now, about the question of discomfort, when we talk of gender, is there in any kind of a dialogue on gender, is there going to be discomfort? Yes, absolutely, there is going to be discomfort. Wherever there are multiple opinions, no matter what you think is the correct path, right? But there are a multiplicity of opinions. This means that some will be more comfortable in a setting like this because, yes, well, finally we are getting to talk about what has been bothering us, what has been disturbing us. But equally, there will be those who have not encountered this kind of a challenge ever. They live in a man's world where the rules are pretty straightforward and definitely privileging male members of society. And they've been used to that since forever. And here they walk into the classroom, where in the confines of the university, as part of the system of the university, as part of the approved systems of teaching, there is a entire challenge to your whole way of being. And so that is likely to cause a great deal of discomfort, because questions of gender, they also intermesh with questions of religion, questions of identity, questions of ethnicity, questions of caste, right? Questions of race. At least when I teach, I do try to incorporate, this kind of intersectionality in my teaching to the greatest extent possible. And, one or two or more of these points can make anyone uncomfortable. So when you are looking at any kind of a setting and any kind of a dialogue that is happening on gender, please remember that the discomfort is part of the process. It is very unlikely that there will be such a setting, there will be such a discussion, and there will be no discomfort at all among anyone. Now that's one attitudinal challenge which then we have to go over. We cannot at that point say that, look, there is so much discomfort and let's just not have this conversation. I think that really will be a problem. As a teacher, I continue to have these conversations, but what I do is that I tell my students straight up that there will be discomfort. So I think if any of you are in any setting where you're either participating or you are conducting a dialogue on gender, it may be worthwhile to just announce, and this is a practical tip that I'm giving you, that this is a thorny issue. It is going to cause discomfort. Perhaps, you could lay down some rules in terms of how the conversation can be, because the conversation can get extremely heated. That is also something that I can tell you, that conversations around gender get very heated with people taking sides, lots of polarization, voices being raised, so on and so forth. Now, particularly in a classroom setting, I cannot afford, for example, raised voices, right? So you could perhaps lay down a rule that we will have the conversation, but we are going to keep it dignified. But I have also been in other settings. For example, for a very short while, I was interning with WISCOMP, which some of you might have heard of, Women in Security, Conflict and Peace. And, those settings, more closed door settings. And I think there is perhaps a little more room for louder expression of this discomfort. Of course, everything has to be kept within the framework of basic respect and basic dignity. However, the point that I wish to make by talking to you about this experience is that this is a conversation where there will be discomfort. And so the best thing to do when you're engaging in a dialogue, when you're trying to sensitize someone on questions of gender, is to tell them that if you feel discomfort about some of the ideas that is being expressed, that is absolutely natural and normal. A second thing, which whenever I engage in a dialogue on gender, I do tell whoever is listening to me or talking to me, is that the expectation that a few classes, 1 week worth of classes, or even a semester worth of classes will change your worldview overnight. right? That is not an expectation that I keep. We have to be speaking from a very realistic place. And, if we expect that after 2, 3 sessions, everyone's going to go back with this little halo around their head and enlightened on points of gender, I think that's not the point. I think the point is that even if a certain chunk of your participants go away thinking about what was said, right? That is also something to count as a win. That is also something to count as a success. Why I say that? That's because the kind of structure of society that we have, which includes, your family, education, your friends, groups, etc., etc. Ever so often, unless you come from a particular strata of society that continuously and consciously engages in these kind of conversations, most likely these would be the first places where you have heard these issues being articulated, right? And anything that happens for the first time, please do not expect that there's going to be an instant result over there. These are long-standing issues. Patriarchy is long-standing structure, and to expect overnight results is also something that's not, I think, feasible, reasonable. However, uh, the thing to emphasize there to your listeners, to your discussants, to your participants, is that can we at least, uh, bother to think about what is being said over here. Now, that requires, of course, a lot of participants to put themselves in the shoes of other participants, right? So if a chunk of our participants are even taking that away, I think that would constitute a win in terms of both attitudes as well as methods. Now, so these are basically the themes that I'm hoping that I'll substantiate further, and perhaps that will make sense to you. Now, I must emphasize that although my lecture is focused more on women, most of it is talking about women, I do not intend to exclude other genders. In fact, I start by acknowledging something that many of you are probably already familiar with, that gender, far from being a binary, is recorded on a spectrum. Yes, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, even more than that, when I was young, when my parents were younger, that kind of an education system, we were all taught that gender is a binary. It was normalized to us through school, through science textbooks, through every other textbook, right? But a lot of research as well as activism has been done since then. And now it is not even really a matter of debate whether gender is a binary or gender is a spectrum. It is now very well known that gender is recorded on a spectrum. And that is why we refer to not just women and men, but we are referring to LGBTQIA communities, queer communities, right? And each of these letters in this acronym stands for something different, which explains something different, right? So you have a whole range and everything in between. So I'm very much cognizant of the fact that that politics exists. However, I am going to speak within the scope of my expertise, and that is definitely limited to women's issues. So that's a disclaimer that I would like to put out at the start. In any case, it would be counterproductive for us to not include LGBTQIA communities from any gender discussion on gender dialogue or community and polity. I hope that while queer political and social discourses, they are quite distinct from women's studies, some common themes would still be found, or at the very least, the sensibilities around the latter can find some purchase in thinking about the former, same as many of the ideas that emerge from queer discourses have far wider resonance and applicability. Right? So these are all mutually constitutive discourses, even though there are a lot of differences among all of them, so they cannot be easily conflated with one another. And I do not wish to exclude any of the genders over here. Now, I'll move on to some, basics that we think about when we think of gender. It is very likely that, your young generation might be very familiar with this, but it is also possible that there are those of you who are not familiar with this, and therefore I like to start from the basics. The first is that gender and sex are two distinct categories. Very often when we speak casually in our everyday language, we often tend to use these interchangeably, and we don't really think much about it because it gets the work done. But when you're in a more engaged sort of an atmosphere like this one, or in the classroom, or you're specializing in a particular issue area, there one has to be extremely careful about the sort of language usage that we are going in for. And there, remember that sex and gender are completely different. And sex is often obviously seen more as a biological category, though, there's now feminist doctors and feminist biology researchers who are also looking at the, whether the human body itself is wholly male or female, and they do so on many parameters. But I'm not a scientist, so that is not something that I will venture into. And of course, gender is something that is seen as more socially and culturally constructed. So basically, what happens in a binary understanding of gender is that the codes of gender are superimposed based on what your body looks like, which is what is your sex at birth, right? That is how you are assigned a gender. Now, sometimes this might be a good fit, which is often what is referred to as being cisgender, but sometimes, this doesn't fit very well. So you could be born with a particular body, and, your orientations or how you feel about yourself could be very different. Now, this itself is not something that is known at the time of birth. This is something that you discover through the process of your development through the ages, which is why this becomes another thorny issue, because many a times it is not till a little later in life do you actually able to clearly identify yourself. This not just involves the introspection and thought process of the person who's trying to identify what their gender are, but they also have to have requisite information, right? So many young people, I think, do not even have full information about, what all these categories are all about. So by the time they are discovering this information, they've gotten on in age, and that's when they are able to find that particular fit. And this is why, that conflation of sex and gender, very automatic conflation, becomes a little problematic, which is why we need to think of these two categories slightly differently. Now, there are, of course, a whole host of explanation about gender itself, right? There are a lot of theories about uh, how is gender constructed, how do we know what gender we are, and how do we behave like the gender that we are. There are many, many theories about that. This is, for me, particularly important. How do we behave around what gender we are? Now, some of the early theories, they came from psychology. So you've probably heard of Sigmund Freud, right? He's a well-known psychoanalyst, and he's a very, very controversial one, who's given a lot of ideas, but a lot of his ideas are excessively problematic, particularly from a gender perspective. They are quite problematic. Now, one of the things he spoke about is how children discover, very early on what gender they are by being curious and by exploring their own bodies. No, society tells them how they decide. They teach them the biology, and then based on that, children get to, as they keep growing up, they decide their gender. And in this way, the idea that he emphasized upon is anatomy is destiny, right? This is also something that is referred to as biological determinism. What does this mean? It simply means that the biology that you are born with decides the fate of your entire life. Now, even as I'm saying these words, I think, you can see how this is very problematic, because this seals your fate at the time you are born. And then as you go on in life, you struggle with the gender codes that society has generated for you, right? Knowing very well that you could have options, but you're not using a lot of options because there are social codes that are operating. A second approach, which also comes from a combination of psychology and biology, it postulated that men and women develop different behaviors in order to increase their chances of survival. And this is not just, in their own generation, but this is across generations, right? So there's a genetic component to it, that as you change your behaviors, that behavior gets etched onto the genes. Those genes then gets passed down across generations, and then that determines your chances of survival. Now, therefore, men are required to be promiscuous. The more the number of children men are able to reproduce, they're able to have, that increases the chance of their genetic material being perpetuated, and this is brought down to a question of survival. On the other hand, women therefore are required to be more selective. Why is that? Because most of their energy is it goes in, first of all, carrying the child, right? That takes up a lot of energy, and then caring for the child, right? So because both those things take up a lot of energy, so women are very selective about, who they have children with, how they have, how many children they have, so on and so forth, whereas men are far more freer thanks to processes of reproduction as to how to do it. Now, this also, you can see, is a very, very problematic theory, because again, what this does is that it gives a free pass to certain behaviors while restricting certain other behaviors, because you've been told that, this is your biology, that therefore this is your fate. This is how you must behave, and these are the only ways in which you can conduct your life, right? So anything, both are coming from psychology, but you can see that there's a very clear element of biology also going on here. Now, all of these theories, they have actually been questioned by feminists, and these ideas have been rejected. They have been debunked. And this rejection has not just come from those of us, who study the social sciences and humanities, but even those coming from the sciences. They have rejected a lot of these ideas. So then what explains gender? What explains gendered behavior? And here I am most convinced on one particular theory, which is referred to as the theory of socialization. Some of you might again have heard of this theory before, right? Now, this is far more accurate in terms of describing, why when we are born a certain way, we end up also behaving a certain way, and why any deflection from that is viewed as non-normal, right? And this postulates that children learn from culture and society how to identify as male and female, and therefore they adopt masculine and feminine behaviors. This is something that all of us have experienced, and perhaps this idea may seem intelligible to many of you here. We pick up clues on how to be and how to behave from our surroundings. And I think that's very easy to understand, where all we pick up the clues from family, we pick up the clues from household, from schools, from playgrounds, just about anywhere that we are. And also this, please include the media in this, places like internet, places like television. We see something there, it fits in our mind in a certain way, and we decide that, okay, this is how as a girl I must behave, or this is how as a man I must behave. So this is referred to as socialization, where society provides you with the clues, and that's how you decide how to be masculine or feminine. So therefore, those who wish to fit in to society, they learn more conformist norms, right? They learn how to conform. They pick up those particular clues which conform. And therefore, those who don't wish to really conform, you find many of them questioning, challenging, and breaking with many of these norms. For many of the people who are along the wider gender spectrum, these norms may appear entirely illogical and not useful at all. It might be full challenging of their entire personhood. Now, at this point, I'll also refer to Judith Butler, who gave this idea of performativity. Right? What she essentially said was that through the process of socialization, we perform our gender. So, for example, if I'm dressing like a woman or someone's dressing like a man, right? Talking softly like a woman, someone's talking, loudly and confidently like a man. We are performing. We are performing. We've been taught this is how you have to be when you step out in public. And so you follow those codes and you perform. And why is it a performance? It's almost theatrical how we do it, instinctively, without thinking. In that sense, it is a performance, and this is what she was pointing towards. So I'm just putting this out there because this is again something that you can think about when you think along lines of gender. And because it is performative, then the question arises, can we change how we perform? Can we change the ways in which we are compelled to conform and perform? Can we do something differently? If we have been taught to do something, can we unlearn how to do something and relearn how to do it in a less abrasive, less patriarchal manner? Which is why I have put this out there for you. Now, another way to look at gender, it is through the lens of power. I mentioned this in the beginning. I think, it is entirely useless to have any lecture, any conversation, any dialogue on gender if you're not going to grapple with the question of power, right? Now, this is also not a psychological or a biological understanding. This is also a socio-cultural understanding. Women's and men's behaviors may be shaped by how power is distributed in society. Since most social cultures are patriarchal, they assign greater power to masculine behaviors and also greater rewards to masculine behavior, and therefore men are rewarded for being men or manly. And women are, feminine behavior is seen as a manifestation of powerlessness, to the extent that if women exhibit power, they are castigated. They are told that, this is not how they should behave, and there are costs that come with non-feminine behavior apart from powerlessness. What I'm trying to say, therefore, is that such behaviors may not be biologically ingrained but are learned and adopted behaviors. It also normalizes something called heteronormativity. Yeah, the idea that heterosexuality and therefore classic masculine and feminine behaviors are, within quotes, normal, and all other types of behaviors that do not conform to these codes are therefore either non-normal, or a word that I avoid using but which is used a lot in society, and I do not like that word one bit, abnormal. Abnormal is a word when it is used. I'm sure you've heard it being used. It is spat out with a great deal of disdain. It's a very loaded term and it brings all kinds of connotations with it. And that's why I just prefer not to use it. And if I do have to describe something, well, then I would say non-normal, right? Now, I'm at no point is any feminist, including me, denying that there are very clear biological differences that do exist between men and women. But what has happened is that society over centuries and millennia has constructed gender appropriate behaviors socially. Defying these constructed behaviors comes at a very high cost and with penalties. Once you combine gender based power asymmetry, and it's very clear there is a power asymmetry, with coded behaviors, it is easy to see how and why patriarchy is so pervasive. Perhaps one of the most disturbing fallouts of biological determinism was scientific experiments where, the sizes of men's and women's brains were measured, and apparently that data showed that women's brains are smaller and therefore women are less intelligent, less efficient, and therefore not fit particularly for public tasks. All of these experiments have now been rejected. They have been completely debunked. But there was a time when entire society took such scientists carrying out such experiments very seriously. And I must add that these experiments were not just done to prove that there is an inferior gender, but these were also done to prove that there are superior races and inferior races, right? So you can again see, how so many of these activities are so deeply problematic and at the root of a lot of problems that society faces today. Now, another issue which I would like to flag apart from, theoretical entry points into gender is the debate between equality and difference. This is a debate, again, you can see it playing out in other types of politics, especially identity politics. It also presents itself in feminist discussion. The central question is very, very straightforward. Do women, other genders, want to need equality, or do they want a recognition of the difference vis-a-vis who the male? I will discuss the bare bones of this debate and emphasize that it is as yet unresolved, with good arguments being presented by both sides. But I do take a side. I'll tell you that. But you are free to explore this argument a little more before you decide, which side of this political spectrum you are on. Now, postmodernist critics, in any case, have said that creating any sort of binary, whether women should struggle to achieve equality or should they look out for valorizing their differences, it is in any case a false debate. I mean, any binary is false, and therefore it is counterproductive. But anyway, let's take a look at the arguments. With women claiming civil and political rights in what is often referred to as the first wave of feminism, formal equality was instituted. On legal terms, therefore, men and women were finally at par with each other. And that is when, a lot of people started saying, well, patriarchy is gone because now all of you have the right to vote, right? And this is an argument which you hear even today in different formats, it circulates in society. Now, it is very clear, though, that this is not having legal equality is not the same as having substantive equality. This is a basic political science argument that, when you enter a political science class, you get to learn this, and this applies equally to questions on gender. Also, the binding social norms, they did not vanish with the coming in of formal legal equality. Also, the obvious biological differences between men and women do not vanish. So the struggle for parity continues on these grounds. However, as patriarchy would have it, it can be very insidious. While suggesting that now women are equal, they must do exactly the same things as men. And this is dog whistle for the fact that women must not seek a world where the differences ought to be taken in consideration. I am clearly pointing towards affirmative action policies based on gender. Anything that looks marginally like affirmative action, for example, things like, a special coach in the metro trains for women, or, 4 seats in the general coach reserved for women, those sort of things. Yeah. But of course, a more serious version of that, these are relatively minor examples. Yeah. This is what led to the politics of difference, that women are different from men, and we should be proud of those differences, and we should emphasize those differences. This led to two lines of thought. One led to the idea that women have some ingrained qualities such as nurturing, loving, caring, etc. And these are specific qualities apparently that women have. And these were sought to be valorized as being special sources of feminine power, and also, therefore, to be deployed to create a better society. A second line of thought led to affirmative action demands based on both biological functions of women as well as historical discrimination. The problem I see with the first line of thought is that it can lead to a very essentializing and stereotypical view of women, and end up placing the burden of what in feminist discussions is referred to as care work, a lot of which is unpaid, and even on women, even the burden of bringing about a peaceful society, right, a non-violent society. The entire responsibility of that is placed on women. That these are your qualities, so you are the only ones who can bring about peace and build a loving society, so on and so forth. And what does this do? This frees men of the responsibility of taking these tasks on. Right? Do you see the problem over there? The men can say, okay, we are going off and off to doing other things, and you please do all the hard work that is required to make a foundationally peaceful and caring society. These are also they'll go on to do those tasks which are seen as the natural domain of men. So there's a great amount of stereotyping going on over here. In the beginning, it might sound like a compliment when it is being thrown out, but when you are engaging with these issues intellectually, you've got to see beyond that compliment and see, what kind of categories are we creating here, and to what end. However, there are scholars who do espouse the first line of thinking. For example, a certain branch of ecofeminism, for example, who adhere to these views. So just to put it out there that, we could have one view, it's not necessary that every feminist shares our particular understanding of feminism, right? Now, if you were to ask me, I do find the second line of thinking far more interesting and useful. It has led to gains such as maternity leave, childcare leave, and now the latest period leave. We are also talking about that, which acknowledges the differences between men and women. The idea is to make the world a more comfortable place for women. And I think this is very important because for the longest time, the world has been a very, very uncomfortable place for women to be in. And that is the sense that I am saying this. These are requirements that have just been taken for granted. Women are just, well, this is how your body performs. So you please deal with it, lead your life and deal with it, with no thought about, can we construct the world around us in a way that can ease some of these difficulties that come with the various processes that are part of biologically being a woman. Women are expected to grit their teeth and go through with these functions without any expectation for care. I'd like to add here that some of the functions can be life threatening and life changing. For example, before the advent of modern medicine, childbearing meant that many women would lose their own lives in the process. It is not till modern medicine came in that childbearing has become slightly less risky, but even now you're all aware that there is a fair amount of risk with just becoming a mother. Now, I mentioned ecofeminism earlier, so I will refer to yet another fault line that occurs in the understanding of gender, that of nature and culture. According to this view, which oddly enough coincides with this pernicious type of stereotyping of women, women with their ability to reproduce and nurture are seen as being closer to nature, since these are closer to the activities that nature performs. Men, on the other hand, are seen as builders of culture, using agency, reason, and logic. I call this pernicious because it assumes that men have no role in reproduction, which is wrong, and that they are incapable of and therefore not responsible for nurturing and caregiving. Again, taking away and placing all these tasks in the hands of women. Similarly, women are wholly excluded from the realm of building civilization based on culture, whereas there is ample proof that women are equal contributors to both culture and civilization. Now, this is how the language was used earlier, closer to our times, where when I say that, I don't mean the last 10, 15 years. I'm talking about 200, 300 years, maybe even more than that. How has this fault line manifested itself? This is manifested as the difference between public and private. Based on all the gendered constructions that I have discussed above, men and women were neatly divided into the realm of public and private. That is, the public was seen as the realm where men carried out activities and women were relegated to the private sphere. So this has had very serious consequences. Women have been kept out of education. They were kept out of a vast variety of professions, saying that these are not things that you can do. You stay home, learn languages, while the men went out and learned science and mathematics. In fact, women were not even seen as claimants to spaces, geographical spaces such as cities and towns. You please stay within the four walls of the household. The streets of the towns, the any other places in the towns and cities, they were all places that have been physically claimed by male members of society. This fault line is so acute that it brings us to yet another issue which I would like to talk about, which is that women are now then relegated to such levels of powerlessness that they are not even talking about spaces, they're not even given the right to bodily autonomy. Decisions about women's bodies are also not in the hands of women. How do we know this? Many of us have experienced it. Those of us who have not experienced it directly have probably seen our family members or female friends experiencing this, right? And this is again decided by the gender that has greater power, that is men. Again, this is something that is a reality not just for women but LGBTQIA groups. Bodies of non-male genders, non-cisgender men, they are all sought to be policed in one way or another. And so we see quote unquote debates on issues ranging from whether a woman can get an abortion or not, or how she should wear her hair. Should she cover her hair? Should she uncover her hair? So, ranging from the most advanced countries in the north to the far less advanced countries of the global south, absolutely everywhere patriarchy is rearing its head in this way. And these are not personal issues. These have become flashpoints around which debates are raging in nations. Now, I've spent a good chunk of time talking about basic feminist discourses. You could look at this as centralization, and of course, without having a grip on these ideas, it is very difficult to create an atmosphere where a dialogue that is gender sensitive is possible, right? When you enter into a room to talk about it, as I said, the reason we talk about the basics is that even those who are not entirely convinced by these, in terms of their beliefs, cannot claim that intellectually we were not aware of these debates, right? So that's not a free pass that they get to exit from any dialogue on questions of gender sensitivity. Where men and women enter into a discussion, the knowledge of the debates may assist men in having a better understanding, especially of the long and painful history of patriarchy, and it will provide women with persuasive basis for arguments that they can push forward. It is necessary also because gender issues are often wrongly perceived as a domain of women. This is something I would like to say. If this was not about men, then I wouldn't use gender, I would use women. This is something that I would like to flag, that patriarchy, its codes and its norms, they also impact how men behave. And men may also not be entirely comfortable with the codes of behavior, and yet they must constantly be under the pressure of proving, how macho they are, how male they are. And in that sense, they end up conforming to many of these behaviors, which could be extremely debilitating. So, it's not just women who are at a loss. Men are also at a loss in many ways. I've had many young men coming and telling me that even the choice of what they were to study after class 10 was dictated by their gender. For instance, if a boy wished to study the humanities and social sciences, he was often derided by being told, well, these are things that women study, right? So even those choices are then not available. So that's why this cannot just be the burden of women. The labor that's required to understand, the work that is required to understand gendered power dynamics and to attempt to dismantle them is therefore ends up falling solely on women and other genders, freeing cisgender men from performing this very arduous task. This yet again is a benefit of patriarchy that only men get to benefit from. It shows us that being male is not a burden and is most definitely a privilege when it can be worn with so much lightness and without any additional labor to be performed. In my view, this can at best be a false perception, since men stand to lose as much by patriarchy as do women. Men are often forced to conform to codes of behaviors. To give an example, the constant pressure to perform masculinity, especially through the use of machismo and violence or threat of violence, means that those men who do not wish to conform to these codes would not be valued as much in society as compared to men who do wish to conform to such codes. I must add here that I do find the younger generation of your generation far more receptive to understanding both concepts and critiques of patriarchy. I come from a generation where men were far more resistant and defensive at the very mention of these ideas. So that is definitely a small change that I have seen happening over here. Now, I'd like to shift my attention to linking some of these thoughts to the question of dialogue. If we are looking at resolution of issues and enhancing understanding through dialogue, taking a gendered view of issues is imperative. What would this imply? To my mind, it means asking the question, say, for example, how does XYZ issue impact men, women, and other genders differently? That is how you engender an issue. In some cases, women and other genders are entirely invisible. For both historical and socio-cultural reasons, they are excluded from discussions. Therefore, the first step is a focus on participation itself. There is a certain logic, for example, to the idea of the kind of participatory democracy that India had in, starting 1947 to 1950, which is that all viewpoints and perspectives will feed into the making of our democracy. A different array of perspectives on issue areas under discussion cannot come forward if no one is present on site who is affected by the issues and can bring these forward in a cogent and persuasive manner. And this can only be rectified by greater participation. An immediate example that comes to mind is something that are called manels. This word has entered and is now entrenched in the Urban Dictionary. It refers to a situation in the context of formal events and arenas of discussion, for example, conferences, where an entire panel is made up only of male participants, manel, M-A-N-E-L. Well, it started as a bit of a sarcastic joke, but I just brought this up here because I don't think it is a joke, it is a reality. And so why not use a very interesting term that has been coined to describe this situation? The popularity of the use of the term manel is to indicate the absence of women. The reason I'm pointing this out is because only when one knows how to look for the absence of women will we learn, will we be able to point out. So this is would probably be a condition or a precondition to dialogue, whichever way you'd like to look at it. To give another example of success in a dialogue, this is a more successful area, I will refer to the discipline of international relations, which is the area that I have my professional training in. For the longest time, questions of traditional security, including discussions around war and peace, were seen as the domain of men. Now, this was questioned by a feminist IR scholar, and some of you may be familiar with this name, J. Ann Tickner. She took Hans Morgenthau's Principles of Political Realism, which is, canonical in the study of realist IR theory, and reframed these principles to show that women are participants in political decision making at all levels. They are impacted very badly. I'm sorry about that. By extraordinary events in the international system. And by that, what do we mean? Say war, pandemic, any of these. These are all referred to as extraordinary events, right? Yet they were completely absent from any discussion of how the international system should take shape politically. Today, of course, that has changed, and you have a plethora of scholars and, in fact, a whole separate theory and discipline called feminist international relations. Simply by increasing the participation of women in a particular area, women's voices have started to count, they have been amplified. More sophisticated arguments that explain the world through gendered lenses have been developed. A further example of success in this area is the United Nations Security Council resolutions. There are several of them, with 1325 being the most first and most well-known one, that have acknowledged the role in women in war, peace, and state formation processes. It has built programs to rectify the absence of women, as also to provide for requirements that arise that are specific to women. Post-war reconstruction of state and society also includes specific concerns of women now. This has been possible only through a continuing agenda to give visibility and voice to women at every level, from everyday conversation to sharing experience and expertise at the community, national, and international level. So I see this as a successful example of dialogue, but you can also see the amount of work that went into for pushing a gendered view forward. The second issue that arises from the first is, apart from giving visibility to women, also give us voice. Traditional social codes require women to be demure, submissive, and quiet. This has led to a culture where women with a voice are frowned upon and efforts are made to silencing them. It also means that a lot of women will be supremely underconfident about speaking up in the first place, even if they have an opinion, because they're simply not encouraged to do so. Now, the silencing itself can take innumerable forms. It can range from, co-option, right down to threats and coercion. So many of these tactics can be used to silence women. If one includes women without letting them speak, once again, the gender perspective is lost. While teaching my students, I came across a piece of research on protest movements against dams in the Garhwal Himalayas. So these were, they are extremely powerful protest movements. The author who wrote that piece of research was carrying out an ethnographic study. She found that while women, who are equal and significant stakeholders as far as environmental resources are concerned, were present but were not allowed to speak at any of the meetings in these protest movements. When they did speak up, they were disrupted in various ways, such as being booed, being asked to keep their speeches short, continuous talking among the men folk to drown out the women's voices while the women were speaking, continuous ringing, and the use of mobile phones, etc. This is also an experience that many women may have faced, being present someplace but being ignored over there and being interrupted while speaking. So the question of voice is very, very crucial. In fact, referring back again to the idea of the Urban Dictionary, there is now a popular term for this: mansplaining and manterruption. I am not sure whether any of you have heard this before or not, but given that you're younger than me, I'm sure you must have. The first word means when a woman is equally and also possibly more knowledgeable in an area, but men assume she has no knowledge and start explaining, things that they know back to them. The second simply means a woman who is talking and is being interrupted by a man. We probably would not need to invent these words or even use these words if these were not real phenomena, but we needed to capture this phenomena that is going on. And that's why, these words again have entered the urban dictionary as well as popular usage. A third issue that I would like to flag, in which everyday language is gendered to the disadvantage of women. Language and linguistic scholars have done research on this area and correctives have been brought in. Again, a small example, and it's a very small example, but it is a very impactful one, is the use of pronouns. For the longest time, in order to refer to people, the pronoun he was used as if it is default, thereby again privileges that which is male. Um, while this may appear minor, it carries on in subtle ways the normalization of the male principle. This has changed now with increasing references to both male and female pronouns, and in many cases, the female pronoun itself is used as a default. Another development in this area comes from the queer movement. Pronouns now include they, them. Several LGBTQIA persons prefer this more gender neutral pronoun to indicate that they are non binary and would like to be addressed as such. Why this is not minor is because how you address a person is the first point at which you grant the dignity of personhood to them, right? Without this, you're practically not treating them as, dignified people. So this is the underlying conceptualization behind the importance being given to what pronouns are being used. Therefore, the manner in which they choose this dignity to be granted matters a great deal. Now, continuing on the issue of language, gender biases in the real world continue to creep up in the casual everyday use of language. And when we are entering into a dialogue which is around gender issues or any other issue, but wanting to bring in gender sensitivity, I think how we use and deploy language is something that we have to be very mindful of. This will require two things: some grip on language and a great deal of mindfulness about gender issues and power asymmetries. Now, several expressions and metaphors reflect these biases. Therefore, the use of language itself is crucial in a gendered dialogue. For instance, when we say women are very caring, again, the issue is not here that women are not or should not be caring, they should not care, but that the burden of caring and the burden of care work is placed solely on women's shoulders. I'm sorry, the electricity is gone off, so you may have to deal with poor light. Um, Solely on women's shoulders by essentializing this in this manner. Sometimes we may use these terms as a compliment, as I mentioned this before, but if you were to think about it from a gendered lens, it becomes problematic. Care should be an essential human characteristic featuring in the lives of all genders, including men. This, and I think many men would also pride themselves on being very, very caring persons. So the distribution of care work itself will have greater parity built into it if we start by changing the manner in which we deploy language and therefore start changing the norms on which our world is built. As much as speaking is important, because we were talking about giving women a place and a voice, so is listening. This means that what has been referred to as engaged listening, where the mind registers what is being spoken and is able to absorb it better for the purposes of understanding. In a more formal dialogue and discussion setting, therefore, engaged listening on gender-related matters, such as gender roles, socialization, identity, relationships, etc., have found more success. So this is from research that I was reading up on, where group discussions are held, and the researchers wanted to note whether those who are participating in these discussions, are they merely listening mindlessly, or are they registering and absorbing the discussions that are happening, and what are the issues that they seem to be more interested in when gender-based discussions are happening. Now, there was far less these, I mentioned the ones that were successful, but there was far less success when it came to discussions on gender, on structural gendered inequality and questions of power and privilege and cleavages along gendered lines. Now, as such, none of these issues are less important than the other, but the latter set of issues provides us the underpinning of skewed gendered relations. Incorporating discussions using these phrases and mindfully listening to the issues being raised around these themes can go a very long way for better gender sensitive discussions. A very interesting piece of research which I found on gender biases was in the area of artificial intelligence based applications. real world gender biases often creep into technology, so when the coding is done for these programs, whatever biases we carry as human beings, we end up incorporating them in all of these programs, and particularly in a lot of these artificial intelligence based applications. um, Now, real world gender biases often creep into technology, which, no matter how cutting edge these technologies are, how intelligent these technologies are, is based eventually on human agency and intelligence. As the world moves more and more towards the use of AI, we find it replicating all the flaws contained in our very human discourses. And so, what we are doing is that we are reproducing these flaws instead of minimizing them. So, again, the minimizing of these flaws again has to be a very, very conscious discussion, and that will be based on participation, voice, as well as listening engagements. An example which I think all of you will understand very easily is the use of female names Siri and Alexa, right? Irrespective of the gender of who is asking the questions or who is giving out the instructions, it is the woman who is made to follow the instructions. This is not an accident. I'm pointing this out because, again, this is part of our everyday lives, and so quickly, one can pick up this example. These are the biases we must consciously be able to identify so that we can improve how we communicate, both speaking and listening. The last thing that I would like to say and end this lecture is that ultimately there is, thanks to patriarchy, a great trust deficit. And I'm sure, since you are participants of this dialogue, you know that having some amount of trust is essential to a dialogue. So if you have a very large trust deficit, you can have the best structured dialogue, best structured forum, but unless you bring in also gender sensitivity, I don't think you will be able to really attain very effective results. So whatever I have spoken about today is designed to reduce the trust deficit that is there in society and to increase the efficacy of dialogues. Now, at this point, I'm going to stop my lecture. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for this insightful talk. And I think now we can open the floor for discussion. So you can share your comments. You can also ask your questions. So feel free to raise your hands and engage directly with our speaker.
I have a few comments I would love to share.
Yes, Pragya, yes.
Okay, so a lot of what you said, Dr. Sucharita, it just brought home so many discussions we've been having. Right from, I think, when I was in class 2, there was a classmate who was male, and he was very fond of fashion designing. And I remember when you said that, and he told me that he cannot give an entrance to it. He has to do engineering because that is what will get secure income, because he has to be the person who brings home the bread and keeps the fire burning, and he's the only son. So there was this responsibility, and there's this burden of patriarchy that is also on men. So that was one of the things that I remembered when in your talk. Another thing which I kind of remembered was we interviewed a lady who works for she runs a foundation which works on promoting women into politics. And one of the things she said she finds very annoying is that people so when you tell them that there should be seat for women at the table, they instantly say, but what have the existing women done? So they point at a Mayawati, yes, or a Jayalalitha or a Mamta. But then they never point out that they will never say that, oh, look at a Mulayam or a Lalu Yadav, and what have, so then there should not be a seat for men either on the table, because they are just as bad. So it's like for women, we have to prove to be given that seat, whereas men just occupy it, without any. So I think there were these little nuances that and I think you covered like in the entire spectrum from biology to psychology to social aspects, and it was it just like a lot of bells rang in my. Thank you for that. So.
Thank you so much, Pragya, for your comments. If I were to just, respond to your comments, I know these are not questions, but, I find it very problematic when very casually, it is said, what has a Mayawati done? What has a Jayalalitha done? What has a Mamta Banerjee done? These are, among other things, very casteist things to say, particularly because, Mayawati has been a target of these comments for a very, very long time now. And I'll just respond just by making, an observation that I see. So I live in Noida, and there's this huge park in Noida, which Mayawati had gotten built. There's a similar park in Lucknow. I'm sorry, I'm just forgetting the name of this venue. Every weekend when it opens up, you see a lot of people coming there, and these are not posh or well-dressed people. Most likely, they're people belonging to the lower castes and lower strata of society, right? Now, if vanity projects are being made by people belonging to the more privileged strata of society, then in that sense, where is the harm in building vanity projects to give confidence to those who do not come from the most privileged sections of society, by either in terms of class or in terms of caste? That is one. Secondly, I think this is a very uninformed and ill-informed sort of a very casual statement that is made. And you're quite right. Somehow, women political leaders are put up to greater scrutiny than male political leaders ever would for the same. And I have spoken to people, who have insight into what work Ms. Mayawati might have done. And they can clearly point out the effective work that she has done. And absolutely the same goes for Ms. Jayalalitha. The same goes for Ms. Mamata Banerjee, right? So you're absolutely right in your observation that it's almost as if, there's a race to the bottom, but even in that race to the bottom, you're not going to let the women win, right? That's how I see it. And that's why this women's reservation bill is such a thorny issue. And purely on the basis of participation, I would totally, I would totally support it, because when, there is a dominance of male members of society in the well of the house, in our representative institutions, well, we could as well ask the questions, what great things have they done? We are not, as women, a whole lot of us are not benefiting. We're not seeing a lowering of patriarchy. So that's probably how I would like to add to the comments that you have made. There's a comment in there's a question in the comment section.
Yes.
Zoya, should I take that?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
yes.
I'll just read that out. And I think this is Ms. Mona Lisa Kaur.
Yes.
The question rather reflective. When we are working on the nano niche profession, we have been facing the stereotypical underpinning of the work that we do. How do we bring awareness on this behavior to the people doing it and create a mindset of working on this trust deficit? Ms. Kaur, can I ask you, what do you mean by nano niche profession? I'm sorry, but I'm not aware. If you could explain that to me, then I'd probably be able to better understand.
Yeah, thank you so much. First and foremost, let me just say that was a very fast insight, and it was a very inclusive insight. I would rather request if you can share some insights with us so that we take our time to digest the advanced things that you've actually shared. So, Nano Niche, I'm working in a realm of emotional intelligence, which is basically.
Mona Lisa, ma'am, actually, we can't hear you properly.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you.
This is much better. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. So basically, what I'm working is in the realms of emotional intelligence, and what I'm a trainer as well, if I may just put myself in a silos. But the thing that we are doing is much more advanced than what is prevailing at the moment as a training fraternity, routine of teaching and training people. So when we are working and when we do a program, so what happens is all these people who are part of the training fraternity, what they do is they underpin and, take it as, oh, maybe this is something, maybe just a trend, which is just catching up kind of, they're underpinning the work that we are doing. I have put in 26 years of work, and that doesn't mean that I'm just coming from somewhere just like that. So what happens is the kind of behavior, some people like me, we have the capacity to reach out to different places, but there are a lot of people that I see who take it in a very bad light, and then they don't have the grit to stand up again. So how we as women and much more intellectual beings, if I may say so, be part of the awareness that, okay, you're doing this behavior which is unacceptable. And also get them into a mindset of, okay, you need to trust what people are doing. They don't stand up and start speaking just like that. So there is a lot of work that goes into it. So if you can just share your thoughts about that. Thank you.
Actually, thank you so much. I am totally in agreement with you on this. And I can only speak from my experience in the classroom because, like I do my training in the classroom itself. And as I mentioned to you, there are days when there's so much resistance, and that resistance comes in very direct verbal forms. It comes in very indirect forms through facial expressions, which you have to read and understand that, you're saying something which is really putting this person off. And sometimes this reaction to what we might be saying, right? We get very aggressive responses as well. And of course, I'm a teacher, so there's obviously I'm not talking about physical aggression at all, but you can sense that somebody sitting in the classroom is not liking the fact that you are challenging them. So as is the case with all these things, continuing conversation and continuing liaison is very, very important. So, for example, sometimes it has also happened that, I've moved out of the setting of the classroom. Perhaps the student has come to me, just accosted me on the way, in the garden, in the corridor, has just come to my office to visit me. It is a little more relaxed atmosphere. Then there are fewer people. It is more of a one-to-one conversation. So what I normally do is that I soften my tone, and I make it a lot more friendly. And I also make it a little bit humorous and, somewhat jokey as well. And then in a very light-hearted way, I rephrase and ask the same question and say the same thing. And this time what I do is that I do not talk as a teacher alone. I bring in a very human connection that, look, we're both people, but I feel that you can be better than this. Why don't you tell me why you think like this? That very often gets me a response. It does not work 100%. I don't think that is possible at all. But very often, just asking them, why do you think, please explain to me, instead of me telling you how to behave. Why don't you explain to me what is your logic? What have you seen? Why do you think this way? That then breaking that down bit by bit. And of course, this happens over a period of time. Two things happen. One is a softening of that defensive attitude, and the minute there is the softening of that defensive attitude, the person sitting opposite me is automatically more receptive to what I'm saying. Again, they may not change their attitude, but 200% I have probably made this person think once or twice. I can talk about two cases in my career. I see that as a very big number, which have come and told me directly, where the script has flipped from misogyny to the other side. And these were two young boys, right? But what I also noticed is that this is a very time-consuming matter, and at all times you have to, as a trainer, remain friendly, approachable, which does not mean that there are no boundaries, but there is a framework for having a continuing conversation and a certain friendliness of tone. You say that, okay, why don't you start by telling me why do you feel this way? So it works more when I engage less in a debate and more in a conversation where they am drawing them out. So very often what happens is, bits of their personal lives come out, and you as a trainer get an explanation for what happened. And once you get an explanation for what happens, you can calibrate your responses accordingly. A lot of the formal literature on gender that we study, which is very, very crucial for our own intellectual understanding, but when you are listening with other human beings, I feel that sometimes, working with them at an emotional level, as you said, you work with emotional intelligence, that has worked for me far better. Far, far better than taking on this position of, I'm your teacher, I'm standing in the classroom, I'm teaching you this syllabus, I have these very strong beliefs, and you must agree with me. I mean, that has its own uses. it has its own function, but this other style of conversation has a whole different functionality. So what I'm trying to say here, I suppose in short, is getting them to open up rather than me putting my views forward to start with. This is, I can speak from experience, perhaps this might help you in your training. I don't know.
It does.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the response and for the question, Mona Lisa, ma'am. So I can see, Akansha, that you have raised your hand, so you can go ahead and you can ask your question.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this lecture, like extremely fascinating lecture. So I have 2-3 things to say, not exactly the question, but the first thing, when you were talking about the idea of performativity, so it reminds me the paper written by Iris Marine Young, The Throwing Like a Girl.
Okay.
If you have
Iris Marine Young, yeah, whom I have read in other contexts, yeah.
Okay. So she had written a paper like Throwing Like a Girl. So there she critiqued some of the others, like how they have seen women like you should sit like that, and there is this, they talk about this is in the nature of the female, like women from the very young, they don't put their arms that much up to throw a ball and like that. So that was the thing, like that just not a comment, I think it just reminded me, so I just mentioned. The second thing I want to mention is the participation. When we I'm a student, so we have a class for the feminist philosophy of feminism, and the participation, the registration for this class were more from by the side of girls. There were only 1 or 2 male participants. It's like the interest to see the perspectives and all is still very, not in that much level. They're not interested at all, even talking normally. So we have the patience, it's a long process to bring male into this talk, but still we are in not that much phase. So that is from my experience being a student as well, and even not even the classrooms, but in a friend circles or even at home also. It is not still up to that level, but we are in the process trying to bring those people into the more into the talking about this, the level of both, not only the feminist thing, but also how men feel, or what they feel, or what they face the problems while being into the masculinity things, or being into that level. And the third thing, I just from the decolonial feminist standpoint perspective, it's like the value and the knowledge of the lived experience. What always come into my mind, like when we talk about the care, we talk about the care ethics. I'm working on the field of environmental ethics, so sometimes I also read regarding as you ecofeminist thing, not into that, but still some of the portions. So like, why should a knower care about the things? Like, if I'm caring, it for me, I also should be aware that I'm caring about the things. But people assume you are women, and it just into your nature you care about the things. So I sometimes it feels like we should be aware. Even if a male caring about the things, it should be an awareness, not just you thrown like it's in your nature, or it's being into these matters. So I just wanted to mention all these things. I don't have any question, because your lecture is really very smooth and very clear. So the doubts are not there from your lecture itself. So thank you so much again.
Thank you so much.
I'm very grateful to listen to you.
Thank you so much for your lovely comments. And in fact, I agree with you. The first point that you raised, that is exactly what I was talking about when I was talking about socializing. Normally, when I take my classes on gender, I give examples from, and this paper is at the BA level, right? So I stick to the BA level. And I give examples from daily life in which, things like ways to behave, any restrictions which are differing for men and for women. Those are things that are brought up in class. And even, choice of subject, for example, choice of profession. And perhaps it won't be so surprising, but students become very emotional when I talk about these things, because many of them for the first time are hearing their feelings and their thoughts validated by a teacher, right? So they break down into tears, and they tell me stories, this has happened. And so the idea is to bring them back to this point where they find the vocabulary for what is happening to them. And as someone who teaches gender, or anyone who works with gender, whether it is Mona Lisa ma'am here or you, the idea is to have that grip on vocabulary. The grip on vocabulary is important because that's where the grip on knowledge is coming from. Suppose we talk in more vague terms about how we are feeling, there is even less chance of us getting seriously. Now, that's not something we should be scared of. We all speak from wherever we come from. But at the same time, if we are getting, we have the benefit of this training, rather, we have the privilege of reaching this position where we are taking training, I think it's important for us to have a grip on all of these concepts and all of these ideas, so that we can also, we know how, when, in what way to push back and resist. And to me, teaching a lot of these things is also a form of resistance. It's also a form of resistance. So I completely agree with you. What was the second point? I'm sorry, I've forgotten. What was the second point you mentioned? You spoke about.
It was the participations, like still even classrooms.
Yes, yes. No, so that is a problem. That is again definitely a problem that I very clearly see. And and that's why when again I have these discussions with either my peer group or people younger to me, which is mostly my students, I always emphasize, this is the first question I bring up, that I'm talking gender. I'm not saying women. And so men are definitely not excluded from this. And yet, when you're sitting here, you look bored, you look disengaged. That's a huge challenge. I have to tell you that that is a massive challenge for me. And that's why in some of our discussions, I clearly bring in examples and ways in which men are affected by patriarchy. I do that as many opportunities that I get, because that is the way to grab the attention of people who otherwise believe that this somehow does not affect them. But the minute you start giving them, examples that are hitting very close to their personal lives, immediately there is a rise. Now, however, I do think that, the paper that you are studying is feminist philosophy, and what I'm teaching is gender. And I can completely understand that what you are saying, the truth of what you are saying, that bringing in more men into those spaces is a huge challenge, right? But what I have also seen, I've seen a lot of younger men, if not at the master's level, but at least at the well, M.Phil is no longer existing, but earlier when it was existing at that level, and now at the PhD level, definitely showing an interest in entering, gender studies and doing masculinity. So, well, I'm hoping in another 200 years, when would, it has taken millennia for us to get here. So I guess it'll be another 200 years before, men start filtering into classrooms on feminist theory. But I think the point for trainers, people like us, is to continuously emphasize that when a lot of the wisdom that is coming from either feminist theory, philosophy, or from queer theory has far general application than women. We are here talking about the shape of society, and that society definitely includes men, in fact is dominated by men. So I think emphasizing that, bringing in men's experiences into discussions, making them open up about their mindsets as possible, those are the things that will probably help draw them out a lot more. But I grant you that it is a humongous task to have a class where you'll see, 50% men, 50% women, and the class is titled Feminist Political Philosophy. I definitely think that's a challenge. And that's why the dialogue has to continue in informal settings. Because if the men are not forthcoming in the formal settings, well, then, there are the channels through which those learnings can be disseminated. And informal settings would probably be a good place for that.
Yeah, exactly. And one just more thing, like when we're talking about in general, they just take it personal, very personal, and they started like attacking, like you are targeting every male. I'm not like that. I'm like, that is not the thing. We are not attacking on you. It's in general. So take it as general. So it is like 2000 साल का बदला मेरे से ही क्यों ले रहे हो? So they're making comments like that. So
true. So absolutely. I get that a lot also. But the fact is, Kanksha, that that is the feminist motto, right? The personal is political. And my response to that is, well, I'm sorry, but the rules that you made has affected me personally. For the last howsoever many decades that I've been alive, the rules for restricting women's movements, behaviors have taken it personally, and yet somehow I have not been given the space to get angry and walk out, right? So, I mean, you are not here to fix a man who's not willing to understand. And but that should not be a deterrent to you to carry on these conversations in spaces where people are more receptive, right? So these are challenges that we are bound to face, for the simple reason that we are throwing a challenge to an established system, even in the most minor way, right? So I think that is something that, well, I have gotten used to it. So it depends on the context, depends on the situation, depends on the person. On that basis, I make a decision about my level of engagement. If I feel that, this resistance can be lowered, then I definitely make an effort over there. If I feel that this resistance cannot be lowered at all, then I pay attention elsewhere where I can actually make a difference. But as far as I'm concerned, patriarchy has hurt me very personally, so it is very personal.
Thank you so much, Akansha, and thank you so much, ma'am, for responding back to this insights. I also have like something to share with you. So with whatever that you have shared so far, and with so many sessions that have attended, in today's session also you brought this up in between, that thinking is a very important part, introspection. Like we hear a lot of things today also, I heard so many things, but if I don't go back and think about each and everything, and then I don't relate it to what's actually happening in the society, and when I engage in dialogue with someone and I just state the facts and I just tell them the reality, I feel like they won't be able to understand what I'm telling. So I think an important aspect of dialogue is starting a dialogue with your own self, and understanding how exactly you want to communicate with the other person. At the same time, when you engage in dialogue, you need to listen to the other person, as you brought up many times. So yeah, this is something which I'm taking myself like in today's session, and this is what I've realized so far with all these sessions that I've attended.
Zoya, I absolutely agree with you. Self-reflexivity. Yes. But I must also say that I think, women have introspected so much, and we are continuing to introspect. LGBTQ communities, because of their everyday experience of all types of violence, both direct and indirect, that is brought to bear. We are always thinking about, what is our place here. So it would be nice if, for a change, those of us who are at the receiving end were not be the only ones to do the introspection, but those who stand to benefit are also self-reflexive. So again, like I mentioned, these are not changes that can occur overnight at all, right? And therefore, having courses like yours, which include sessions like these, continuous platforms, as I mentioned, both formal and informal, they have to continue. They must continue everywhere for this conversation to firstly remain alive, because it's so easy for, because of power asymmetries, for even this conversation to die down. Forget about introspection. Introspection will come at the next stage. So easy for the conversation to die down. So keeping the conversation alive itself is a very big task. And so I have no disdain at all when people say that, oh, we're just talking. As far as gender is concerned, right? Unless the issue is kept alive, we cannot have a programmatic agenda. That is what, if you're looking at the UN conference, all the various UN conferences on women, including the one, the historic one in Beijing in 1995, is a culmination of the fact that, the conversation around issues of women have continued for centuries. If we are talking of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, it is a culmination of this. And the fact that somewhere someone was listening and introspecting, right? So continuing the conversation is very important, and how it disseminates is also very important. I think what you cannot control is eventually who listens and how do they respond. I don't think that is something we can control, but we have to continue the conversation on our part anyway, though I do wish there was greater introspection on the other side.
Yes, I think introspection also requires one to, think in a very idealist way. And when we start thinking in a very idealist way, what I feel is like sometimes when I think about reality, it discomforts me. Like I don't feel good about what's happening around me, and I feel why people are not willing to think. Why people are not willing to do some introspection is because they don't want to feel that like that stress, or maybe they don't want to challenge their own beliefs. So if I speak to people like this should happen in a certain way, so they say like it doesn't matter, like the world is actually like in this way. So I feel like we should come out of our own comfort zone. Of course it like you will feel uncomfortable, but it will help us in a very long term. So yeah,
I mean, very little change actually happens smoothly. There is some discomfort is always involved in bringing about this
yes,
kind of change. I think all of us as human beings have experienced changes in our life, and we all know that they were not comfortable at all. So here we are
yes.
taking on a millennia-old system. There's going to be some discomfort.
So are we having more questions? If you have any further questions, you can raise your hand. And
Can I have one?
yes,
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 please.
yes. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much, ma'am, for beautifully delivering the concepts of gender conversation in such a way so that we understand it from our own perspective. It's not a question, it's actually an observation. Since you said that students get emotional and you identify and you empathize with them accordingly. So, since we all here as participants, or I myself take lectures in different sessions, and usually the participants are from different socio-cultural backgrounds, even
Right.
they believe they are from different school of thoughts. Even we as participants from different school of thoughts. Are there some verbal and non-verbal indicators whenever any gender conversations took place that uh, as an participant, or I can say as an expert, I could take aside me, so that I believe that the person is getting emotional, or his conversations are gender driven, and so that we can react and take control of situations, or I could say take control of dialogue conversations accordingly.
Okay, Mr. Hashim, thank you. Actually, a very interesting question that you've asked me.
Thank
So,
you so
firstly, when
much.
I use the term emotional, I don't mean it in a negative way at all, right? I mean it in the nicest sense of the term, because I think, this idea that we are all operating in a world, keeping our emotion aside and only operating on reason, I find that idea very problematic. I think all human beings have emotions, and a lot of what we do is driven by those emotions. And expression of emotion is also something, uh, particularly in the context of, let's say, a gender class, where it's in any case, it's a very in the presence of a teacher, whatever emotions come out, they anyway come out in a very controlled sort of a manner, right? So that is one thing that I would like to emphasize. A second thing that I'd like to say is that I'm from a political science and international relations background, and these are again subjects where emotion is often not the subject of discussion. But now there's a lot of new research that is coming in, which is making emotion, foregrounding emotion. You see, anthropology, sociology, these have always taken cognizance of the idea of emotion. All science has done that to a lesser extent, but now, that is being taken cognizance of. And the minute we say the personal is political, it automatically includes a person's personhood, which includes their emotions. So that is the second thing. And so therefore, emotion for me is a very useful research tool. Like you said, it's a very useful indicator. Now to the main question that you have asked, is how do we understand verbally and non-verbally? So verbally, there have been situations when I have probably taught, it's a particular topic, and I've taught it from the book. So I've taught the theory. I've said, what's the components of the theory, so on and so forth. And usually what happens then is that that's my style. I have a tendency to give an example. Many of the examples, what I observed, right, in the classroom is that they seem to touch a chord with someone or the other. And of course, the same thing will not affect everyone equally in the same way. So I usually leave a little bit of room for discussion after my class. And sometimes I also encourage students to raise their hands in the middle and, ask me something if they wish to ask. And so at that moment, I have had this experience where a lot of students have told me personal stories from their life, which are usually very emotional stories. And I've been very lucky. I've had lovely students. They have articulated themselves and their emotions very well, and I've let them do that. Especially, let it come out of their system. Let them say what they have to. Sometimes I don't like also hearing some of the things they have to say because it is on the opposite side of my beliefs. But I allow them to say it, right? Even if I have to eventually counter it, I let them say it. So for me, stories, personal stories is a very important part of gender-based education. And I simply cannot imagine a class in which you just have theories but no personal stories. In fact, the entire feminist philosophy and feminism is built on women and their personal experiences. So how can I stop my students? But having said that, I must hand it to my students that they've had a lot of faith in me, that they've actually told me some of their personal stories. I mean, that takes courage. It takes a lot of trust, right? So that is generally an atmosphere that has to be built slowly in class by being non-judgmental to a great extent, right? And generally creating a learning atmosphere where a student is not scared of telling you, but is wanting to enter into a conversation with you. And I feel that, an excessive display of authority on my part would be counterproductive to that. So some humaneness, even though I do realize that I'm a teacher and they're my students, there's an age difference, etc., but a certain level of human connection in the classroom is what will draw my students out to talk verbally. So that has happened as far as the verbal cues are concerned. Non-verbal, now that is very interesting, because there I have had to literally train myself to observe students and their reactions. And I have a far smaller teaching career than some of the greatest, gender and feminist theorists of our times. I mean, they've been teaching for much longer. I've been teaching for much less. But I started observing, these flickers on students' faces. Sometimes, they are puzzled. Sometimes they're very happy that, oh, ma'am is saying, what has happened to us. And sometimes they're clearly very angry. I've had experiences of sitting in class where the entire 40 to 50 minutes, her student has been very angry with me and has been looking at me, daggers drawn, but can clearly not say anything because they've taken up this optional paper, they have to sit for exams, they have to get the marks, there's all of that, right? So these are things that you develop simply by observing people. And again, I would say a classroom is a great place because it's a controlled environment. There is a particular time slot. There is a clear set of students. Over a period of time, you get to know the students. You lead the conversations in such a way that, and not just leading the conversation, the subject is such that draws out emotions. This is a topic which draws out emotions. I've had men nearly close to tears in my class. Sometimes not in the class, but sometimes right after I leave the class, they'll come behind me and, they'll tell me something. So again, reading some of these expressions, some of the expressions are very inscrutable, but then some other expressions, it's very clear. It's very clear what that expression says. So as a teacher, I have to be very, very mindful that when I am teaching particularly a subject like gender, there are very real people with very real experiences, and my theory has to connect with their experience. Either it has to connect in a positive way, or even in a challenging way. That's fine, right? So this is what I observed, and this is something, picking up the non-verbal cues definitely comes with time and practice, right? And another thing which I later realized as a teacher is that many times I will hear many things which will go contrary to my own views on gender. And I have very strong views. I have, no problem in saying that I have always been, and I am, and I will remain a feminist, a staunch feminist. So we do hear views that are very offensive, right? But here's how I think about it. Either you can draw battle lines, right? Or you can open a conversation. And even if there is great discomfort on my part, I would much rather at least try and open a conversation. If it doesn't go somewhere, it's all right. But at least I tried.
Fine.
Right? So this is what I can share with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You absolutely done it perfectly, that it is better to draw on conversations and try to deliver the speech about the gender in such a way so that people come out and narrate their stories so that we can make them understand the concept is better. That is the only way we can do.
Absolutely.
Empathize with them and make them clear about the concepts of gender. Thank you so much. Honor, really.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the response. If we don't have any more questions, I think we can just close the session. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hands. So I think we don't have any more questions. Thank you so much, ma'am, for delivering this wonderful lesson today. And thank you so much to our participants for your patience and cooperation. I hope you all have a nice day. I'm so sorry, my voice is gone almost.
Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Behzad. Thank you, Zoya. Thank you, Pragya. Thanks to all the participants who came up with such lovely responses. And I had a very nice 2 hours. And I wish you all the very best.